So in my last video, I started talking about my long-standing interest and enthusiasm for looking behind the scenes of creative work and seeing the creative spaces, the studios, the workshops, the environment within which an artist creates his or her work. Whether it be a fine artist, an illustrator, a film, prop maker, even a graphic designer, I love seeing the artist's studio, their setup, the equipment that they're using. So in this video, I want to highlight one of my favorite artists, James Jean, and talk about and review and investigate his studio spaces. I should say that this is just one of many artists and creatives and designers of all kinds who I want to talk about. So if you're interested in seeing more of these behind the scenes type videos, consider subscribing and maybe hit the like button if you find something interesting or enjoyable. So James Jean is a Taiwanese-American contemporary fine artist and illustrator based in Los Angeles. And whilst I could make a whole series of videos admiring and talking about James's vast library of incredible work, I really want to try and focus on his studio spaces and what interests me about the way that he has everything set up. And James is particularly unique and a great person to study because we have loads of photos of all of his studio spaces that he has inhabited and used over the years, which is pretty rare for artists, as well as a lot of photos of him behind the scenes working on his actual artwork. In this video, I really want to mostly focus on James's current studio space, but what is interesting is the range of spaces that he has inhabited over the course of his career, from fairly small rooms in the side of his house to what looked like medium-sized loft conversions to a massive 30,000 square foot dark warehouse, and now to his current space, which I'll talk about in a minute. What's interesting about all of these spaces is how his work almost becomes a reflection of the character of each space, particularly this large warehouse he was in around 2010, and certainly also with his current studio. A lot of work that he was creating back around 2010 was maybe bright and saturated in colour, but it was also quite rough and scratchy and almost kind of messy and uncontrollable, which is very much a description of the space as well, as you can see. In this article, James says, "I used to work in a huge, dark warehouse studio in downtown LA, frequently alone, and the fog of depression and inactivity easily settled in." I mean, even in some of these photos, you can see that James looks kind of depressed, and you can see how his work was somewhat a reflection of these feelings. And we can see that he was obviously having to light the space with these massive artificial lamps, at least some of the time, I'm guessing, which is not fun for obvious reasons. What's also worth noting is that unless the light is very diffused, it can actually cast shadows on the canvas whilst you're working, which can sometimes get in the way. And they can also cause reflections on the canvas if the paint is very, very flat and smooth, which again can also get in the way of you observing the colours and the paint properly. So yeah, I suspect that James might have had some issues with those, but I'm sure he knows what he's doing, so maybe not. In addition to that, there are a bunch of other little interesting details that I could talk about and mention and discuss, but if I did, this video would be insanely long, so I do want to move on to James's current studio space. So what's really interesting is firstly the contrast to the warehouse space that we just looked at, but also that this current studio is his family home, something that is certainly particularly unique, even more so that he literally works in the main living area within his home. I did actually find the floor plans for his entire home, but I felt that was a little intrusive for me to share in this video. However, the main observation from those floor plans is that his studio space is certainly the largest room in the home and takes up quite a big majority of his property. So I thought that was quite an interesting thing to see. This article on wallpaper.com quotes James as saying, "Since art is an all-consuming aspect of my life, I could see that the house could become an efficient machine for the production of my work, whilst also functioning as a fun and beautiful environment for my family," says Jean. The history certainly added to its allure, but even without that history, the space was incredibly special and well suited to my work. It goes on to say, "The heart of the house is a large open space with Jean's art studio on one side, benefiting from the upgraded skylight and the main seating area on the other." James's space is particularly interesting to me because most artists tend to have a completely separate room or a building or even completely separate location to create their work. And of course, this is largely to create a separation between work life and home life. right? If you work from home like I do, you'll definitely understand why some people prefer to do that. Some people also find that separating work from home is important to reduce distractions, which can be very important if your work requires a lot of focus and concentration and attention. Someone like the Japanese artist Daisuke Tajima is an excellent example of this, and I plan on talking about his studio space in an upcoming video, so definitely stay tuned for that. But of course, what I should also say is that having your studio or your workspace at home can really be the perfect setup for a lot of people. And it's quite clear that James is one of those people. The article goes on to say, sitting right at the heart of the house, the open studio suits Gene perfectly. Top lit and spacious, it is practical as a painting and creative space while keeping him connected to the daily rhythm of family life. There are constant interruptions throughout the day, but they provide a much needed friction to creativity that sometimes leads to more interesting work, says Gene. I love the light and the open space and how the simplicity of the house is punctuated by incredible details. The facade of the house doesn't reveal much, but once you step through the door, it's like entering the playground of my mind. What you'll notice about this space is that the interior is quite sparsely decorated, right? The furnishings are monochromatic, pretty much, and there isn't really anything on the walls aside from the large bookcase and of course his own paintings and sculptures. I'm guessing this is very intentional, okay? So the room's primary purpose is the production of artwork, and so many of the room's contents or lack of content are there to purely facilitate that process. We can see that James uses a number of these white trolleys to hold his equipment paints, his larger brushes, which he uses for washes in the later stages of his process. He also has these pre-mixed paint pots, similar to Takashi Murakami, which I'll explain later in the video. Pointing out his trolleys might seem like a fairly insignificant detail, but for me this is super interesting because as an artist myself, I understand the importance of what we call first order retrievability, meaning you want to have all of the tools that you use regularly not packed away in a cupboard, but literally right next to you, in arm's reach if possible. When you're producing creative work, you don't want there to be any friction between you and the creation of your work. And you can even see here in the previous studios, he has most of his important equipment right there next to him. You don't want to have to search for or look for a particular paint or a brush. So that's what James is doing here with that equipment. One other small detail that I noticed is the use of soft floor mats, which I suspect are used just to protect the floor from the paint and also provide a level of comfort for long work sessions, which of course is a fairly obvious thing to point out, but it's important because you want your work environment and your space to be as comfortable as possible. This comfort makes you less likely to sit down and do the work that you want to do. So it's very important that you make your studio as comfortable to work in as possible for long periods of time, and James is clearly making efforts to do that. I mentioned earlier that James's work is often a reflection of the studio he inhabits, like many other artists, and we can see that this very clean, organised, controlled environment has also resulted in a very precise and meticulous stylization to his work, which is quite a big shift from his earlier work if you're familiar with it. He does make some deviations from this, but generally speaking this does seem to be the case. In this article, James says, "Since I share the studio with my 3-year-old son, I'm surrounded by colouring books, toys and children's books from Japan and the US. The aesthetics of design for children has affected my paintings as I try to compete with the ultra-saturated colours and kawaii iconography that surround the studio." Whilst I didn't want to comment too much on James's actual work, one interesting thing about his process is the back and forth between canvas to digital. I believe his current process is to start with a pencil drawing, which is then brought into Photoshop or into whichever program he uses and coloured digitally, and then it's printed out on large pieces of paper with the colour swatches printed alongside it, which you can see here in the photos. And then he'll mix acrylic paints to match those swatches. And you can see the small paint marks on the swatches where he's attempting to match the colour or match the paint to the swatch. And then he'll make a small pot of that paint to finish the entire piece with, so that he doesn't have to keep mixing it every time and the colour is consistent throughout. Interestingly, he also assigns a number to each swatch so that he knows what colour to use on the actual canvas. And I'm not 100% sure if he has assistants helping him with this process, but I suspect he probably does, at least with blocking in some of the basic colours, just because I imagine it would take an enormous amount of time to complete just one painting with this process. And if you're familiar with James's work, you'll know that he's a very, very prolific artist and sort of constantly producing work. So So as I mentioned, using computers and digital equipment is definitely a part of James's process. So I've always been curious about James's actual desk setup as well. And you can see a couple of photos here showing how he has his computer set up in the main studio space. Sometimes it's just a laptop, sometimes it's an iMac, you can see there in the distance. And then we have this slightly more recent photo of his desk in what looks like a different part of his current studio space. It looks like he has 3 or 4 of these white tables stacked up against each other, which I'm quite jealous of because I think we can all agree that a lot of desk space is a good thing. But I should also say that this is quite an important detail or aspect of James's desk area, because not only are white tables clean and simple and not distracting, right? You want a simple monochromatic background when you're drawing, but having a lot of table space is also very useful because it's the most efficient way of storing or holding equipment. As an artist or a creative of any kind, really, you want your tools, your equipment, your paper, sketchbooks, and in this case, printers and scanners and camera equipment. You want all of that to be instantly available. Okay, you want it to be in sight and quick and easy to access. And James doesn't want to have to search for his equipment because it's going to disrupt the flow of production. And in some cases, it might even prevent necessary work from being completed. If you want to be an artist or a writer or a creative of any kind, you need to have your equipment out and ready to use. Okay, you don't want to pack it away or put it away in a cupboard. You want it to be easily accessible. And of course, James has a lot of space to do that, so he can have 3 or 4 of these large tables to do this for him. Just on a personal level, I think this is really a dream setup for me. I don't know whether you guys can resonate with this, but comment down below if you're equally jealous of James's studio as I am. The large open space, lots of natural light, the tall ceilings, loads of desk space. It feels homey, but at the same time, very organized and efficient, and really the perfect space to think and to be creative and produce artwork. So yeah, it's an incredible space, and hopefully you guys found something interesting and informative from the photos that I had to show. But that's the end of the video, and thanks for watching. If you stayed to the end of the video, I really appreciate it. Consider dropping a like if you found something interesting or enjoyable, and also consider subscribing as well, because I've been making a lot more videos like this going forward. But until next time, thanks for watching.